Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles, and this is a special edition where we get to bring back friend of show, host of Masha and the Bears, Maria Repnikova, to talk her new book, The Soft Power of China. And to interview Maria, who better than your favorite foreign correspondent, Deep State Kuba. So I'm very excited. So let me bring in our interviewer, interlocutor, the one and only, everyone's favorite middle manager of the Death Star. Let's get his take on this new Obi-Wan Kenobi series. Deep State Kuba.
Hello, everyone. I have to admit, I'm a little nervous because my training has been more in interrogation than interviewing, but I think that there is going to be some overlap between those skill sets.
Well, that's why I embarrassed myself off camera with you and Maria, so I wouldn't look that stupid.
You're emceeing your show, never an embarrassment, Jason. You've got nothing to worry about. Well, apart from all those surveillance devices that
and my horrible geography.
And your horrible geography.
Romania, Poland, tomato.
Mm-hmm.
And go ahead.
We are both vampire countries, and until like about 2008, 2012, we were in a dead heat for Europe's saddest country. But their GDP has just been lagging a little, so it looks like we're not last anymore.
What is Europe's saddest country in your opinion?
So probably Moldova, but that's just greater Romania. So we can put them together. That's the new epicenter of sadness. Thanks to the EU funds going into Polish agriculture, we're safely in second to last place, but Moldova and Romania, that's where you can still get the pure, uncut, existential misery.
Is there still all those? There was a documentary that came out in the 90s about all those kids in Romania, those like homeless kids.
Yes. So, yeah, the Ceausescu regime, he was the dictator of the Romanian People's Republic, very long tenure, and it was almost like a European North Korea, because he ran things outside of Moscow's playbook, and had a number of initiatives that went above and beyond what was required of him, including policies to encourage women to have as many children as possible, to sort of increase the Romanian nation, have more soldiers, have more workers. But those moves backfired in a generation of abandoned children, of orphans, of people, kids that no one was adequately looking after, especially once the socialist state got gutted in the post-communist period, and there was a lack of resources going into public services. So you end up with street kids in the thousands all across Romania.
Like another level of street kid. It almost felt like they were like almost feral.
Yeah, no, that's what happens when you deinstitutionalize children that aren't full grown, and you don't bother placing them in any home that can look after them. They start looking after each other and doing what they need to survive.
Well, on that cheery note, let's bring in the woman of the hour. She is the host of Mancha and the Bears here on this channel, and she is a friend of show now for over a year. Has it been a year? Doctor, professor, stylish hair haver, Maria Repnikova.
Hello, hello.
Congratulations on your book.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here with you guys. Good to see you
And
again.
it's a pleasure to see you again.
Welcome back.
Thank you. It's been a while, yeah.
So I will move out of the way and let Kuba do his thing.
First of all, congratulations on the book. It's out
Thank you.
by Cambridge, and it will be available March 31st. I tweeted out the link to where viewers can find it. It's also in the description underneath the show today. So the topic is Chinese soft power, and I thought that we might start by thinking about what does soft power mean for China? How do they think of it, and how do they try to deploy it? And what do they want to do with the soft power that they managed to accumulate?
Yeah, they want to be flying around the world in a fluffy airplane. No, something more serious. But yeah, soft power for China has been a subject that's been like quite I don't know, fascinating, but also just been intensely pursued by scholars and policymakers, and it's been kind of almost an obsession with soft power since mid 2000s, and in some ways echoing, Joseph Nye, the originator of soft power. He coined the term right in 1990, I believe, and he's very much kind of pro American power, and his whole point of soft power was to reassert America's dominance post-Cold War. And China was, in many ways learning from the U.S. At that time. I think now maybe a little bit less so, but looking at the U.S. as a potential example how to strengthen itself. And soft power was one of those things that Chinese government thought it was missing. It has the economic prowess, it has this kind of rise, less so militarily, but still there's some strategic military rise in the region, and of course economic power primarily is what defines kind of China's prowess in the world, but much less so kind of attraction and cultural power, and just the idea of being sort of a desirable nation beyond just its economy. So I think that's something that the government has been very concerned about raising, and in some ways kind of softening its economic rise, right? So that's what a lot of Chinese scholars explained to me. It's not so much something very specific, but notion that, its economic rise is often feared around the world, especially in the West. So how do you soften that rise? How do you kind of soften the edges of this, major power coming out there? You need something that relates to, public opinion, something that kind of shapes perception, something that explains China's mission, something that makes it seem less threatening. That's why soft power became so significant. So that was taken on in around mid 2000s. But then a lot of writings came out, thousands of articles came out in the past decade or so. But many of them are not quite in tune with Joseph Nye, right? They admire him and they invite him for talks and so forth, and they translated his books, but they also critique the idea that hard and soft power can be separated. They kind of see it as very much fused together, and they also, they have a critical take on U.S. soft power, thinking about this as in many ways kind of an outcome or an outburst of its strategic, military, and economic power. So you can't really have a soft power without hard power. That's what Chinese scholars are writing about and critiquing. But also they see the resources of soft power as very, very kind of varied and almost all-inclusive. They talk about traditional culture, ideology, they talk about history, but they also talk about economic governance. They talk about technology, its technological innovation. They talk about its political capacity, efficiency, and mobilization. So there are many, many different ways in which they think of itself as potentially attractive. And that very much differs from what Nye originally intended, which was values, foreign policy, and culture. So that's kind of the big distinction, yeah.
So one of the themes, one of the topics that you discuss in your book is the cultural dimension of Chinese soft power. And when I think of soft power from the Western perspective, the American perspective, or even the rise of countries like Japan, Korea, the global prominence, I hear culture, I think of entertainment, I think of mass media, I think of music, movies. But the Chinese notion of cultural soft power is a little different. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so one big difference is that unlike kind of Korea, Japan, right, where soft power, cultural power is often coming from the bottom up, it's sort of more organic. Like we see K-pop, we see all kinds of other cultural, expressions and products and influences. But in China, it's very much state-driven. So when it comes to culture, the state kind of defines what's the cultural export. And that cultural export tends to be very much traditional culture, so kind of ancient culture, traditional culture. We think about, Confucianism as a kind of, in terms of ideals, but also, when we think about cultural experience, it's not modern at all. It's very much kind of rooted in ancient China. And Confucius Institutes in particular is kind of a manifestation of that, that institutes that teach Chinese language and culture. The key focus is on language, but culture is, it includes like paper carving exercises and, writing characters, practicing calligraphy, dressing up in kind of ancient, imperial type costumes and enacting some of these characters, but not so much like what is modern China, right? And that's something that is also, I think, is a point of weakness, and it's a point of tension. When you ask Chinese teachers themselves and even diplomats, they would say, what is really our culture, right? So, one ironic vignette from that was when I was in Ethiopia attending Chinese Language Day. It was like the United Nations. First of all, the only people who were invited there, which also speaks to the current, conflict in Ukraine, right, were Russians and, some Ethiopians and a few, I think, others, but not so much anybody, no Western diplomats showed up. They kind of ignored the day. So you see this bunch of Russians, so kind of amused by this awkward introduction of Chinese culture. And all of it is, focused on this very traditional kind of simplistic version of, okay, we have the New Year celebrations, right? We have this kind of autumn celebration. We have this
This
very
is
basic
how
kind of
you use
holidays.
chopsticks.
Yeah, this is chopsticks, and you can win a prize if you guess what chopsticks are. You kind of get thrown some kind of a box of, some sort of,
Chopsticks. The
maybe
prize is also
a chopstick
chopsticks.
or
Yeah.
a cup or something. Yeah, very, very like kind of, I guess expected gifts. And then as I was, coming out of this event, there was a little reception, and I spotted this guy who was standing around. He was a diplomat coming from the Chinese embassy in Addis, and he said, what is Chinese culture like? It's like we don't even know what are we supposed to present, right? Because it's like nobody in China, not nobody, but very few people are sitting there and going through traditional tea ceremony, right? So it's like nobody's drinking tea from this, traditional sets anymore. Very few people are. Many people drink coffee, right? It's very westernized. Or if they do drink tea, it's like in a simple bottle with a bunch of tea leaves at the bottom of the cup, right? It's nothing as sophisticated as what they're showing. So he mentioned how it would be nice to portray contemporary culture, but what would that be, right? And the more I kind of probed into that, the more I discovered that it's just seen as more sensitive, because the limits of that are, not very well defined. And if you think about like maybe less so K-pop, but just, digital, whether it's film industry or other kinds of creative outputs are coming out of Japan or Korea, they touch upon a lot of sensitive themes, right? It's like corruption, environmental degradation, morality, capitalism, all kinds of different themes. I think about like
Squid Game,
It's
for
not
instance.
yeah, Squid Game. We don't have Squid Game coming from China, nothing similar, right, coming out. It's a very dark, kind of fascinating show. I mean, I really enjoyed it, but it's not the kind of thing you necessarily see coming out of China today. So, a lot of it comes down to sensitivity and kind of caution. And without that caution, maybe all kinds of things will be coming out of China. I think it'd be incredible to see.
To what extent is that cultural element, that especially modern culture, film, music, things that kids like, video games,
Mm-hmm.
how much of Chinese hesitation or the lack of Chinese champions to go into the or masterpieces to go to offer a global audience comes from the fact that Taiwan and previously Hong Kong were competing centers that were more dynamic and less constricted by official censorship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the lack of constraints, right? I mean, we see that, especially in Hong Kong film industry, right? It was quite successful, but then recently we see a clampdown. So again, kind of the success is very much contingent upon the space for just creating and not worrying about the repercussions, like a creative film or a show or comedy or whatever it is you're producing. When you don't have to think about those kind of boundaries, right? You can come up with something very unusual and resonating. But if you have to think about the boundaries a lot, how do you tell that story? And of course, a lot of soft power, what Chinese soft power should be about, according to Chinese officials, is telling the China story. So what is the China story, right? How do you tell that story? Because that story is fascinating, complex, contradictory, extremely dynamic, right? If you visit China, you see it's such a dynamic, breathtaking place. But you can't quite tell that story without highlighting some of the pessimistic aspects as well. It's not all like any place. It's not all, cheery, or, it's not all development and success and power. There's still poverty.
It's
There's
not all
still,
harmony.
yeah. Exactly, it's not all harmony, and that lack of harmony is what attracts people. Right, they want to see, okay, how does this work? How do those different elements fit together? How do you have, I don't know, all the single women with, great careers not finding partners or husbands, and they hire like a fake boyfriend, right, to take to their family? Like those kind of stories are fun to imagine, like a show being built around. But we don't see those shows coming out as kind of a cultural export. They're more so domestic kind of, stories that are told, or kind of showcased in certain communities, but not so much to the world, because they might kind of embarrass China.
I'd like to get back to this, but there's a great question from the super chat, and I'll bundle it with some observations that I wanted to make in terms of the state media driving the coverage of events within China to international channels, in terms of the emphasis on educational exchanges, especially cultivating ties with the global South. A lot of these tactical choices that you go into detail about in your book seem like they might be continuities with the socialist outreach of the pre-reform period, or even some resonance with the Soviet Union, Pravda, TASS, and of course the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. So do you see that continuity in the methods and the messages that China uses for its outreach and the socialist legacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. It actually was raised to me as a kind of a point of reference by the director of the Russian Cultural Center in Addis Ababa, who was a very grumpy man and smoked a lot of cigarettes all day in his center, which was kind of abandoned. It was one of those historic monuments of Soviet legacy. Like nobody really went there, anymore, but they still had a center. And he mentioned how China is doing everything that we used to do, we being like the Soviet Union, this old guy who's been around for a while, doing these programs around Africa. He says, but they're doing it at a much larger scale, and they're much more successful, kind of like, they're just doing everything at a huge scale. So we've done something similar, but like state mobilized kind of cultural and exchanges and engagements, and paid for trips and educational ties, and very much kind of relational dynamics. You're creating relationships and affinities, emotional connections. Something that Soviet Union has done quite a bit, and China has also done this under Mao. It's not something that's completely new. I mean, there have been all these foreign students and guests and coming into China, but I think again the scale is completely transformed, very dramatically changed. But also we see other elements of difference. For instance, if you look closely at these soft power, sort of engagements, there's so many different motivations, kind of divergent motivations for why, somebody meaning somebody who's enacting this kind of, who's part of this mechanisms, why are they there, right? So you see, for instance, universities in China, right? They're attracting international students, not necessarily because they see it as like, oh, we want to expand the glory of China, or we want to create these relationships, but they want to make money, right? So they want to get students to come, because most students from the global South, they pay fees. They're not there on scholarships. That's something I was kind of surprised by, because I just assumed, okay, they're all coming on scholarships, but actually the majority don't. They come for fees, but the fees are low. So they want to make money from foreign students. They're recruiting them for economic, reasons, but also because it increases their status, as it expands their status as international kind of universities, and that makes them more attractive domestically. So there are all these very pragmatic factors that are part of this kind of soft power expansion, that are not necessarily ideological, or even they have to do much with China's glory, but very much kind of economic gains. Or like teachers who go to teach Chinese language and culture are often driven by the fact that they want to further their own careers as teachers of Chinese as a second language, kind of like ESL teachers, right, for English. And so they're going there for a very particular purpose. They want to practice the skill, they want to have experience, and they're going to go back and get a particular kind of job, right? So they're not that concerned with kind of, again, China's glory, representing Chinese culture, forming these relationships. In fact, they live in very isolated compound-like settings, almost like Chinese workers work for state-owned enterprises. They live at university campuses, kind of dorms. They cook their own meals. They barely go out anywhere. They barely see the country that they're in. So it's not a whole lot of real deep cultural exchange beyond the classroom. So I think that maybe that's kind of different from what I saw when I was looking at some Soviet archives. a while ago, I think a couple of years ago, I looked at some of these archives. It was a friendship association between Soviet Union and Ethiopia. And it was interesting to see just how personalized a lot of the letters were to like various students. And there was a lot of Russian representatives who learned Amharic, and they had like I think a radio station or some kind of programming going on in Amharic as opposed to Russian or English. So they really kind of put a lot of effort into appealing to people on the ground and creating this kind of deeper bonds. Maybe that's kind of also official representation. We have to be cautious, maybe not to over idealize it, but I did find that kind of interesting. And when I met those alumni of some of these programs, they're still alive. Many of them are older now. They really feel attached to Russia today. They have a very strong connection, emotional connection, and they're almost patriotic, right, kind of towards Russia. But when you see people coming from China, they come with very mixed impressions. They enjoy it. They have all sorts of benefits, but they also are very skeptical, and they experience a lot of racial discrimination, which I guess was also the case in the Soviet period. But kind of different impressions, more critique, and maybe that's just part of being more open now. They're able to express them versus before. But there seems to be kind of this nostalgic sentiment about this Soviet experience, and again, maybe that's also kind of a memory becomes a bit deceiving over time when you forget the negative versus positive.
Well, one distinction that I think might be real is that during the Cold War, both the United States and Russia had almost missionary type attitudes towards their international outreach. The U.S., it was the Peace Corps, which likewise go there, represent us, do good, form personal relationships. This will be the greatest experience of your life. And on the Soviet side, I'm certain that both the training and the mentality were similar. And what you're describing in terms of the pragmatic attitude of a lot of the Chinese that go from the PRC to take these opportunities internationally, or the Chinese universities that accept international students in order to claim some domestic benefits, as well as increasing their revenues. That reminded me a little of what you were saying about the organic nature of the cultural exports from Japan, the United States, Korea, where music or film or TV shows are created for market reasons because they're thought that this is going to be successful. It doesn't necessarily have that missionary cause that we want to convince people we need to be a shining light or be a beacon. And in some ways, it's more authentic because you don't have the political ideology as the principal motivator. And it can be more sustainable, too, because an economically fruitful relationship is one that has an incentive to continue. Or if people become fans of K-pop bands, then they'll peruse the rest of the catalog. But if it's kind of sacralized, then as part of a mission, a hearts and minds mission, then people who don't directly benefit from it may become suspicious that this is a channel for propaganda, like many of the George Soros funded Open Society Institutes across Eastern Europe. Not to say that I pass no judgment as to whether or not they were vehicles for American influence, but that was certainly one way they were received in places like Hungary, let alone Russia. And which comes back to, I think, one of the central points that you have in your book, which is how does China cultivate some kind of credibility, some kind of international trust, which would allow it to tell the China story so that it would resonate, not just among Chinese, but among foreigners as well.
Yeah, the credibility factor is still very problematic, and I think it works better or maybe less visible in some diplomatic initiatives than others. But when it comes to media in particular, communication through state media, I think that's one aspect that's been really suffering when it comes to credibility. I mean, first of all, we know very little about how much people actually trust, or not even trust, just engage or aware of Chinese media. That's one thing we just don't have that much information about. Like, empirically, but we do know that there's some studies that are covered in my book that has to do with Africa and Latin America, that in regions where we would expect maybe some take up of these media outlets because they're kind of pro sort of Africa, they present this idea of unity and shared friendship, they're still not that popular. And journalists who work in like Kenya, South Africa, in relatively free environments, media environments, they don't really uptake or take on Chinese media as their key sources of international news. In Ethiopia, where the environment is much more constricted, I saw that kind of state-owned media would, cite or, kind of invoke Chinese outlets, or when it comes to China stories. But still, when you interview people, a lot of them are not aware about Chinese media that much. They still consume Western media as a global source. So the credibility is the key. Credibility, and also I think it's also has to do with boredom. It's just a lot of his stories are too positive. They're kind of it's about harmony, right? It's about the good China storytelling, and the stories are just too, they're a little too positive to consume. They don't have the drama, the conflict, the tensions, and RT is a good comparison to that. Russia Today is much more dramatic. I mean, it's a whole other issue, but it's kind of antagonistic, right? So we see that RT actually has been more popular, say, in Latin America. There's been some surveys that were done about that. So I found that to be interesting. And of course, Chinese diplomats now on Twitter, if any of you follow them, you'll see that they are very belligerent, and they're quite, quite intensely defending China's interests and attacking, not just defending, but attacking the U.S. and, U.S. hypocrisy,
Also,
double standards, all of that. Yeah.
if you start following them, they might follow you back. Like, be
Yeah. Oh my
careful.
God. Yeah. Some of them followed me back. Yeah. I'm a little
Yeah,
nervous.
don't invite the baleful eye of Sauron into your life unless you know how to handle it. The
Yeah, I just noticed that I'm following this guy, Zhao Lijian. He's a very outspoken, like very kind of a militant Chinese diplomat. So if you ever want to see that perspective, you just type him in. Zhao, it's Zhao, and it's Lijian, and he's tweeting right now nonstop about this conspiracy, that the U.S. has like biological weapons in Ukraine, and that's kind of echoing Russian, conspiracy theory. So basically retweeting and sharing it, but he takes any opportunity to kind of share some of these sort of theories, trying to demoralize or shade, put some shade on kind of U.S. Global presence, but very, very active. And when I looked at the tweets, I was like, oh, he follows me too. So I was like, oh no, like, I don't know about this, so
yeah,
a little freaked
every
out.
tweet has now been added to
Yeah,
your file.
exactly. I probably have a file somewhere.
Actually, that brings up another question. One reason why China has such an ambivalent reception in many parts of the world is because of the reputation it has for surveillance, for censorship,
Mm-hmm.
for different kinds of pressure on dissidents or people who even mildly disagree with an official line. To what extent do you think that might also limit people's willingness to engage with Confucius Institutes or Chinese state media?
Yeah, I think that kind of perception is most active in the West, and by West I mean like Western Europe, U.S., Australia, Canada, New Zealand, maybe some other countries as well, but also parts of Asia, right? Like the kind of liberal democracies. You think about, Japan, South Korea. There's a longer list out there, but I think democratic and particularly Western nations have been extremely outspoken and about sharp power and Chinese influence operations. And basically, the kind of the danger there is that all these terms are confounded together, like, soft power, public diplomacy, sharp power. It's all kind of one big bouquet of terms, but it's hard to kind of separate them out. But there is a concern and an immediate suspicion with that any of these initiatives are basically tied to surveillance or propaganda or brainwashing of some sort. So that's definitely an issue. I think in Global South it's a little bit less so, because and part of it is that I think the publics there, the audiences are skeptical of any, channel coming through, because they had such a long experience with colonialism. They're skeptical of China. They're also skeptical of Western Europe. They're skeptical of the U.S., of Russia, of Turkey. So in some ways, you can kind of see this kind of critical gaze
And
of
of
light
each
to everything,
other.
and of each other, absolutely. So in that sense, they're taking in that all in and very opportunistically engaging with certain aspects, but I don't think they necessarily are threatened by it per se. They think, well, to the response of the controversy around the African Union building, right, in Addis Ababa, having surveillance, systems in place. When you ask people about it there, they're like, oh yeah, well, what would you expect? Like they build a building, so they have some surveillance. Like, it's kind of like, what did you think? They're gonna just build us a building? So there's kind of a cynical attitude about that. But I think in the West there's a more more of an anger, resistance, and attempt to kind of overtake or push back on Chinese influence. It's kind of a different perspective here.
Do you think that that may also have to do with the relative vulnerability of media people, students in the global South to Western colonial, post-colonial surveillance and pressure, which is not something that Western audiences deal with, but from the perspective in the global South, it might be like, well, we have to worry about these things when we're dealing with Western, especially Western companies or Western, where core Western interests are at stake. So the Chinese are just a variation of what we've already become familiar with. While for Westerners that assume privacy, assume all of these other civil rights, maybe unfoundedly assume, they get outraged at the prospect that their tweets might be read by someone in Beijing as well as by someone in Langley.
Yeah, I think that's, that is the case. In fact, some authors I was assigning in my course last year on communication in Global South, I think it was a South African scholar, he was arguing that there's this kind of form of digital colonialism that's been taking place in Africa, but he wasn't talking about China. He was talking about, Western companies mining data, right? That kind of digital tech companies, and in a way, that kind of colonizing that information space and taking advantage, of vulnerability of the local economies and so forth. So I think there is definitely like a suspicion, like I said, skepticism towards other major players in the region, but also a sense that, how is China that different, right? Like, and they're offering something much cheaper. Chinese phones are accessible, they're come at a much lower cost, and they're also often more locally kind of sensitive to local context. Like they create certain technologies that are specifically for use by like African audiences, for instance. Like they really kind of improvise and shape their products based on preferences on the ground. So that in that sense, it's quite, a bit of an innovation, and that's attractive and it's low cost. So maybe it comes with some surveillance, but does anything come without it, right? Like it's kind of like, is anything completely private or free of that? Maybe, we face all these different things here too, but we are kind of but part of the ideals and I guess ideology of Western liberal democracy, that you do have that privacy, you do have power over some of the systems, even if you don't, right? So China appears as very intrusive and threatening in that regard, or also used as a scapegoat.
The part of it may also be that the Western intelligence agencies have learned how to soften their image, both through their own soft power, when you see heroic FBI agents, or things
movies,
like, there's that the Jack Ryan show where the dude from The Office delivers democracy to Venezuela.
Jack Bauer with 24, all that crap.
Oh yeah, exactly. Making torture sexy, and
making it a tough decision.
Exactly. Yeah, and he even gets cited in by who's the Scalia in a Supreme Court ruling. So, but what I wanted to ask is, you talk about how different audiences respond to attempts by China to cultivate soft power, and you split it between Western audiences and the global South. What about China's neighbors? Countries like Vietnam, countries like South Korea, countries like Japan, let alone Taiwan. Is China, you mentioned that Vietnam is very suspicious of Confucius Institutes. Has China had any success in its neighborhood in terms of altering the perception of the PRC? And frankly, most of its neighbors consider it to be even more threatening than Westerners do.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that's a little bit absent in the book, because I don't focus as much on the region, but I do recognize that it is one of the key regions where China is also competing with the US for soft power, for its image, for its influence, right? So yeah, we do see a lot of efforts and a lot of emphasis on the regional politics, regional soft power, but so far quite mixed results. And in particular, a lot of suspicion, and something also gets to the question, I think it was asked in chat, about quality versus scale. We see a lot of suspicion of the quality of Chinese offerings. For instance, during the vaccine distribution phase and PPE equipment, during COVID, during the pandemic, a lot of the kind of residents, the citizens of the Southeast Asian countries, they were really resistant to getting Chinese stuff. They were like, well, we'll wait for the other one, like, or we don't really want to take this. Like, it wasn't like a huge uptake because the suspicion was like it's low quality, or does it really work, or there's kind of a reputational dimension there. But also the fact that, of course, China has been much more militarily, we can say aggressive or pushy or present, or you can use all
Assertive.
kinds of terms, but assertive, exactly. So assertive in the region. So that also puts
Pushy
a
is
damper
only
on
for
it.
girls that are trying to move into management.
Oh, okay, cool. That's good to know. I guess I'm not pushy. I don't like management. So no management for me. Yeah. So the idea of being assertive and, militarily kind of, more visible, more present is conflicting with some of these notions of softness and harmony. And I think that, in many ways, Chinese soft power emphasis in the region has been about this kind of, again, community of shared destiny, sharing the wealth, sharing the kind of economic governance, not just tools, but just kind of sharing in the region, kind of like, here we can do something together, we can contribute to your growth, you can be like us. And I think part of that opportunistically is kind of taken on, but at the same time there's a lot of mistrust. So it's kind of this kind of a coexistence of very mixed sentiments, I think, on the ground. We see some surveys, I forget whether it was Vietnam, I think it might have been Vietnam, but it might have been Cambodia. So I can't remember which country in Southeast Asia. There was a survey that was done, and they showcased like this deep, pretty strong preference for like, working with the US and kind of all this very Western ideals. But at the same time, they were very grateful, happy that China provided some of these PPE equipment and all kinds of aid during the pandemic period. So they were like happy to take that, but also not happy with taking in anything else. Like, we don't want to be kind of quite like you. We don't really like you, but we'll take these goods and services and, for a cheaper price. So it's a mixed bag, but I don't think they see themselves, so this Chinese government, as extremely successful in Southeast Asia. And it is kind of a battleground for its public influence. I think Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific, and then after that, I was looking at Africa as the next region where they're, battling or very active.
For me, I bring up the East Asia and Southeast Asia because in a lot of ways, that's the area in which Chinese soft power actually could play the most decisive role. If it could reassure its neighbors, countries like Vietnam, South Korea, Japan might be a lost cause, but the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, if it could reassure those states that it was not a security threat, that it had much more to offer, that it was willing to talk candidly about things that it had done wrong, that it was willing to acknowledge reality, for instance, in its invasion of Vietnam, and try to foster reconciliation of those grievances, then potentially you flip the security calculus, the security relationships in all of East Asia and the Asia Pacific without needing to fire a single bullet. And yet there's an unwillingness to do that. And do you think that the need to hold a party line on things like Tiananmen Square, on things like Chinese foreign policy, on issues like the Khmer Rouge, for instance, in Cambodia, and that gets in the way of China to cultivate that credibility and that trust to shift these relationships in a more constructive direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible, but I'm also kind of thinking, I guess, of several points. One is sort of the analogy of the US, and it's much stronger, I guess, arguably military presence, but it's worse in, Middle East, and the idea that you can kind of use soft power to reconcile its image while, so much damage has been done. Of course, it's a in some ways more extreme example, but, we have that military / conflict with this kind of cultural soft power. And I don't know how much US has really regained soft power in the region. It seems to be limited gains. I don't know if there are any gains. It's really hard to tell, but it's especially post Afghanistan, like how many gains can really count on this kind of awful, tragic withdrawal from the country. Anyway, so I guess I kind of wonder if any countries can kind of combine this militaristic sort of signaling and presence with kind of an image, positive and soft image construction, because you're trying to do both, and it's hard to gain trust if you're doing both. But at the same time, I think part of it is also this very in some ways not very smooth communication techniques, because one has to abide by the party line, and yes, issues cannot be raised. Historic border conflicts, for instance, any kind of tensions on the border in the border regions, you cannot really raise them openly and discuss them kind of in a very, very accessible, open manner, because so many of these topics are censored, so you can't really talk about that or admit any faults from the past or reckon with your own past. So if you reckon with anything starting with Mao and after Mao, and history in general is presented in a very linear way. It's like we suffered so much. China has been under a century of humiliation from Western powers, and now we've risen up, and we're a developing country, and we're just doing our best. Okay, so there's no kind of reflection of what China is doing wrong, or any apologies or any kind of sense of stepping back and saying, well, we're not perfect and we've made some mistakes, vis-a-vis the region, vis-a-vis a particular country in the region, and we want to talk about this history. We want to kind of reconcile. I don't know, even not necessarily make a public apology, but have kind of this really open, sensitive session of listening and hearing, or speaking about this in the media, or inviting a guest writer from Vietnam to write something potentially, not inflammatory, but critical and interesting about the conflicts, the border conflicts and so forth. We don't really see that. And even though they actually opened up a new fellowship for journalists coming to Beijing for 10 months, this was after African kind of media fellowship. They're coming from Southeast Asia specifically. So there's definitely an emphasis on the region, cultivating those kind of media ties, public opinion ties. The stories that they produce are mostly positive, because they also know that they're here for free trip, right, free stay. They're kind of diplomatic relationship builders. They're not there to antagonize or say something negative, and they're very aware that the Chinese government doesn't want to hear that. So quickly they learn kind of the ropes, how to behave and what to say and not to say, and very rarely they express, I think, very critical points. So that kind of space to really work out those tensions and sort them through is not quite accessible, not available. So I think that also contributes to maybe the possibility of some kind of image building that, as you say, could potentially overturn security alliances if they did a really amazing job.
And the reason that this is a preoccupation of mine is that I see it as potentially a tragic missed opportunity. A China which could reassure its neighbors and cultivate the kinds of relationships that Germany has with the other states in the EU, for instance. Perhaps one day even form some kind of multinational bloc or supranational institutions with its neighbors. That would be a tremendous gain for the region, for China, for the whole planet. But the main block that prevents that is the lingering and not unfounded suspicion and fear that many of these states have towards the PRC, which is not to say that the United States has been responsible and flawless steward of East Asian security either. But at this point, it's a known quantity. And while the fact that China can't speak authentically, that it is constricted by the rules of its outside-facing image, that prevents the ability of these countries to work out long-standing grievances and suspicions, and in a way that Poland and Germany were able to reconcile, or France and Germany were able to reconcile after World War II. I mean, Japan has also done a bad job on the reconciliation front post World War II. But which is also a tragic missed opportunity. And so I always find it interesting that discussions of Chinese soft power often have very conflicted conclusions as to what's going on in its own backyard, and as though China is speaking to three audiences: Westerners, people in the global South, especially Africa, and then the third group, which I want to introduce now, is the domestic population. How much of Chinese international soft power efforts are actually aimed at a domestic constituency?
Yeah, I would say it's a significant, we don't have a precise percentage, but it's a significant amount or proportion of the soft power. Sometimes it's even overwhelmingly domestic audience. We see that especially with, I think, wolf warrior diplomacy style, this kind of antagonistic style I mentioned earlier by Chinese diplomats on Twitter. I think most of their audience is actually Chinese domestic audience, because you're not achieving that much through those tweets on the global front. If anything, it pushes back Western audiences. I don't think it's even that popular anywhere, really. I think it's mostly just showcasing China's strength, prowess, and kind of nationalistic sentiment and pride in itself to domestic publics. And that kind of brings me back to the point I haven't mentioned about this Southeast Asia region and the missed opportunities is also the domestic nationalism, right? So that's kind of a force that to be reckoned with, that we often think about in terms of sometimes in somewhat passive terms. It's like, well, here's this nationalistic public opinion. It's obviously shaped by propaganda. So there's no real public opinion in China. It's all kind of a propaganda, sort of squeezed out of propaganda machine. But it is a force of its own. A lot of it is organic, and of course it's influenced by official narratives, but oftentimes they take more extreme positions than the party state. And in those conflicts, especially when it comes to border regions, border conflicts, historically, there have been some scholars who traced that and showed that this party state is very sensitive to public sentiments about these various conflicts. And I think with the India disputes recently, the public sentiment is also very, very nationalistic. It's like this, with all these conflicts. And recently in vis-a-vis Russia, actually, as you might have seen, so many pro-Russia statements, but also kind of anti-West, in terms of Ukraine war. But there were also quite a few comments saying that, we should take advantage of Russia's weakness and take back our lands, in the Far East and Siberia. So let's take advantage of this kind of weakening of Russia right now under sanctions. And yeah, we can be supportive, but let's take lands back too, So there's that kind of nationalistic sense. And the Chinese government has been censoring a lot of these very extreme nationalistic comments. So basically, impediments to maybe external image in some ways are also very domestic. It's both nationalistic public opinion, but also domestic bureaucracy. So a lot of these officials who are, presenting maybe a very kind of somewhat awkward statements, or they don't seem to be very appealing or sensitive to local context, they often are trying to showcase it to their own bosses, their own higher ups, within the bureaucracy. So in that sense, maybe it's a little bit similar to maybe what was happening in the Soviet Union, kind of showcasing to their own guys that, hey, look at how well I've done by, shutting down this foreigner. Look at this picture I took or the statement I made, and sometimes it gets rewarded. We've seen some diplomats promoted. Hua Chunyin, she's still a spokeswoman for the foreign ministry, which I think she's become vice minister or assistant, something like kind of a higher up ranking she received just last year. And she's very outspoken. So you kind of see this promotion sort of targets being met through this kind of rhetoric, which makes me wonder how much of it is also domestic bureaucrats or bureaucratic pressures. So yes, I think it's very significant, and it's often overlooked because when you see discussions of soft power, sometimes in Western media or analysis, they say, okay, China has no soft power, right? It's kind of it's lacking it, it's missing it, it's failing. You can't buy love, all those different titles. But is it really failing if it's doing well domestically, right? If their whole purpose, the way they conceptualize soft power, is that it's also about domestic unity, cultural confidence, ideological unity. So if that's the goal, if it's an important goal, then it's not failing. It's actually succeeding to bolster its domestic standing. And that's at the heart of all their ambitions. It's resiliency and remaining in power for the Chinese Communist Party. So I think when you take that into account, you might not really see it as a failure. You might see it as quite successful, for certain purposes, maybe not so much for others.
So I'm glad you brought up the Chinese nationalism and the fact that at this point some expressions of it are so extreme that they go beyond what the CCP permits and actually run into censorship of their own. And my sense was that when the Dengist turn took place and the CCP moved away from Maoism, the old legitimating discourses of Marxism, Maoism, were no longer persuasive. They needed a new language of legitimation for their governance. And they fell back on a kind of national rejuvenation, national greatness language, which resonates with most populations, but in China, especially after the century of humiliation and looking back to imperial grandeur, there's an appetite for it. There's a receptivity to it. And my concern was that in the Dengist generation, it was understood as a con. This is what we say in order to get the masses to shut up and go along with our rule. But we're really interested in peaceful rise, getting technology from the West, the realpolitik, the pragmatics of it. The subsequent generations after Jiang Zemin seemed to lose sight gradually of the fact that this was a con, that they began to, well, intellectually understanding that Chinese nationalism wasn't the point of the CCP, they became less and less conscious of the need to constrain or criticize or limit its spread in the population. Then you have things like the Asia Cup. I think it was a final, a very important match between Japan and China, played in Shenzhen or Guangzhou, where the Japanese team couldn't leave for fear that they'd be torn apart by the Chinese fans who had been riled up themselves without any provocation, without any instigation by the CCP in this sort of nationalist anti-Japanese fervor. And I'm worried that, the genie's out of the bottle, and in the Xi Jinping and subsequent generations, they may lose sight of the fact that this was ever a con, and that this is the purpose of the CCP, some kind of Chinese greatness that could be threatening and hierarchical with respect to outsiders. And it feels like that's a very, very difficult balance for the CCP to manage. They don't have that much of the old socialist internationalism left. And the alternative is a China first mentality, which is which can be quite dangerous and quite threatening to outsiders, right? Like, nobody wants to be China's Ukraine.
Right. Yeah. That's. Yeah. I think it's. There are very strong tensions, and I think for a while I thought, well, maybe some of these outspoken diplomats are just anomaly, right? Like, they're kind of a few of them. I didn't take them very seriously. I was like, they're just like three guys, or whatever. They're three people. They're not representative of the trends. But then I was thinking about this, just analyzing the recent discussions of Ukraine and looking at all these official statements by not just by a few people, but by many diplomats and by Chinese nationalists and commentators, and you kind of see this really strong threat kind of positioning China against the West, right? Like against the NATO, against the West, and so much emphasis on US and critiquing double standards, and just like almost like the purpose is to assert that China is better, China's it's always China first, China's interests will come first, China preserve its own rejuvenation, China, like it's all kind of thinking of itself first, but also very much like we're uncompromising. We're not going to compromise with you. And you tell us to support the West and sanctioning Russia. No way. Like, we don't have to do this. Like, we're powerful enough to say no to you. So kind of a lot of it is like, you wonder, is it for strategic reasons, or is it kind of like it's gotten so far that, now positioning themselves as aligning with the West on Russia would just make it look really weak and kind of succumbing to this Western order. And that really comes into tension with this idea of shared, what is it called, community of shared being, or shared community,
shared destiny.
Destiny. It's all very nice, big phrases, all about peace and collaboration and treating each other as equals, and China is a peacemaker. But then, is it about, like, is it going to be a peacemaker? Is it really about kind of creating that shared community, or is it seen as strategically kind of going for its own interest? And I think I think it's seen as mostly as a very pragmatic actor. No matter who you ask, which part of the world, it's seen as, okay, China is very good at protecting and defending its own interests, but we can also benefit from some of its ambitions. But yet there is fear and there is concern. What's the long-term goal? What's the long-term vision? I think that's something that is very much
precisely because so much depends on how the CCP perceives China's interests. If China's interests are non-coercive community of destiny, great. If China's interests are more ruthless, but entirely self-directed, provide us with the lithium we need, we don't care about anything else, then transactionally you can deal with that as well. It actually is much less intrusive than the muddled human rights and capitalism package that you get from the United States or some Western powers. But what if this nationalist fervor And Chinese culture, like German culture, has an unfortunate bent towards superiority, which is a cause of anxiety for everyone living in its shadow. And the fear is that that nationalism may begin to shape what Chinese leaders perceive of as their interests. And
Yeah.
what I would love more than anything would be, and I told Summer this before, that I'd like to see Xi Jinping go on a motorcycle tour of the Southwest with Joe Rogan. They could do some
It's a funny image.
DMT. Yep, exactly. Joe Rogan could teach him how to chill out, introduce him to MMA, maybe get him in better shape, right? So he won't be Winnie the Pooh anymore. And
Yeah.
then you could potentially have a reconfiguration away from the sort of suspicion, because in a lot of ways, China is a great country, great power, first level economic power that still has an underdog mentality, a sense of vulnerability. It's a strong country that doesn't know how to be strong without being threatening, because it has been weak for too long. And that kind of reset in the mentality of the leadership of the CCP, I think, would be very fruitful for the region and for everybody else. And honestly, if we just have to like buy a first class airplane ticket to get him to Las Vegas, he should definitely arrive through Las Vegas. And I'll buy the motorcycle, send him on that road trip.
Yeah.
And finally, I think that we've managed to avoid it for so long, but tell us about the Chinese perception of the war in the Ukraine. How are they discussing it? And is Russia becoming more of a target or more of a destination for Chinese soft power?
So how they're discussing it is, as I'm sure many of the listeners have also observed, and that it hasn't been very definitive in this position. Kind of the typical, conflict has many complex reasons. It's very complicated. Both parties should come to peaceful agreements. All kinds of somewhat fluffy language, but at the same time, that ambiguity and the fact that they haven't condemned Russia publicly, they didn't call the war, and Russia calls it military operation. China didn't call it invasion. They're abstaining from that term, and the content about this war, the conflict, is heavily censored. And there's definitely a sense of the way it's interpreted. If you look at all the Western media headlines, it's siding with Russia, right? That's kind of how it's been widely interpreted. And then on the Russian side, until recently, when we're seeing actually China is cutting Russia off some of its, some of the usual exports. For instance, the aircraft parts. Today there was an announcement that apparently China is cutting off some of these exports of aircraft parts. I don't know if it's been all confirmed, but there's been debate about it in Russian media if it is happening or not. But until recently, there's kind of a lot of the official statements where the China is standing with us. It's supporting us. Everybody turned away, but we have a very powerful friend in China. So there's kind of that sense of sort of discursive kind of solidarity, or some kind of a sense of mirroring each other, right? And then there's been a lot of talk about China as being almost like a target of disinformation by Russia, like that's it's echoing so many of its terms and rhetoric and images, even, and using Russian media, and its footage and so forth. I'm a little skeptical of that because when I was doing my research on Chinese media, I found that Russia has been consistently a very sensitive topic to discuss, like the censorship on how Russia is being talked about. So as a result of this, given how sensitive this whole crisis is in general, like where are you going to find the more pro-Russia side, right? Like, the Russian media obviously presents the more pro-Russia story. So if you're not allowed to talk about like invasion or about all the suffering in Ukraine, or like all of that is kind of censored, like what are you supposed to talk about? So then Russian footage is kind of convenient. So I see it as more of an outcome of political expediency as opposed to kind of a deliberate like disinformation attack from Russia. I guess I kind of see it as a little bit more complex than that. So that's one thing. But the other thing that, I actually have a piece coming out tomorrow on this in the Atlantic, and it's basically arguing that a lot of this pro-Russia rhetoric is primarily anti-Western. Like the key sort of object of this rhetoric is the U.S. It's not really Russia. It's not really saying we're declaring, this deep alliance and we're always standing by Russia. It's mostly saying, well, like, this is all the fault of NATO, and the U.S. is equally or more militaristic, and we just, basically like complicating this whole story and saying that the key root of the problem, the key evil, is not Russia here. Russia has some legitimate concerns. We're not supporting what it's doing, but we're also primarily concerned with NATO. So kind of like this targeting NATO, targeting the West, and attacking that basically U.S. hegemony, which has been part of Chinese diplomatic and wolf warrior discourse for many years now. So that's been what I've been observing, and a lot of it is also mirroring nationalistic sentiments and statements on social media. Many nationalistic commentaries about that, but also some critical voices. So it's not all uniform. There's always there are always some voices that disagree with the mainstream or with nationalism, and there've been some really brave and interesting commentaries. Also, some petitions that have been signed, kind of in support or just empathetic towards Ukrainian people and suffering. There've been some images that have been shared, some fact-checking missions that have been deployed. So all kinds of creative efforts, but unfortunately they're a bit short-lived because of quite deliberate and strict censorship. So it's a kind of complex, dynamic picture. It's fast evolving, but in terms of Chinese stance, it's sticking to this similar to Crimea position of ambiguity, but at the same time, because of its ambiguity, it's getting interpreted and co-opted by different sides to make its own story, its own interpretation. I think in America, it's very much China stands with Russia. In Russia, it's also China sort of standing with Russia. In China, Chinese officials will say, no, we're not supporting the invasion. We're pro-peace. So, how long can they maintain that stance? That's unclear. Maybe they'll eventually have to take a stronger side. But their general kind of act, in dealing with conflicts, international conflicts, is generally that as well. They don't really take sides easily. They prefer to stay in the middle and kind of just wait and see kind of approach. So that's not very unique to this conflict.
One of the potential risks that China runs into if it pursues soft power too aggressively is that it will no longer be able to play that wallflower role and let debates happen without intervening. But we're at the hour now, and thank you so much for your time, Maria. This has been very wonderful, very illuminating.
Thank you very much. And it's great to talk to you.
And everyone, buy the book. Also, buy the other book.
Buy all the books.
Buy all the books. Maria has, if you're looking for something quick to read, the new book, March 31st, is a monograph, 87 pages, very tightly argued, a lot of information presented. And if you want to go further in depth, then her first book covers the full spectrum, especially China and Africa. So,
and I always forget where you teach at. Is it Georgia Tech?
Georgia State. So I'm in Atlanta, Georgia State.
Yeah. I always forget. For some reason I thought it was Georgia Tech, and I didn't want to say the wrong school.
No,
I'm not.
Bulldogs, I want to say.
No.
Yeah, I don't know.
No, that's Georgia. That's Athens,
right?
It's Athens. No, that's
now
Athens.
I conclude on the embarrassing note of not knowing my own symbol of the school. Right?
No, I know the colors are blue and gold. Who knows what Georgia State are?
I feel
Pirates?
Really
are they Pirates?
I'm so terrible.
They were a Division II school for a long time, so it's totally okay if you don't know that.
Okay, good. They're not that cool, I guess.
There you go. Now you know
too much. Panthers.
Yeah, Panthers.
Is that right?
See, it's just.
Huh. Weak.
Yes, and if you want to, if anybody wants a free copy of the book, I can always send it to you. So there's.
Yeah.
I don't mind sharing the PDF.
Right there was kind of like, wow, that's shitty.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. I mean, I share my books for free all the time, so I'm not I don't make any money from this book actually. So.
But
there's no money coming in.
Aren't you thinking of Cambridge, right? Like they need to re-gild their chandeliers.
Yeah,
totally.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I'm all about distributing knowledge, whatever. If anybody wants either copy or any articles that you can access, you can always.
What good is knowledge if you can't charge a toll to access it?
Totally. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
So says JSTOR.
With this particular book, actually, it's ironic because they created a new format as Kuba mentioned, it's a shorter book, and they said it's going to be so accessible. That's how they kind of lure you in. It's going to be so accessible, so great, so easy. And then I thought, okay, so it's probably going to be free, right? Or some kind of like, it's going to be something about this. It's going to be accessible. But then I signed this form where I don't make any money basically on the sales. It's kind of like you get this one little payment, something ridiculous, and then it's like, okay, you're done now, And then somebody said, I saw your book on Amazon. It's just $20. I'm like, what? I didn't even know it's like selling on Amazon, because they made it sound like it's only online and you can just access it anytime. But actually, it is printed and it's coming out, and they're making money on it every time somebody clicks. So I'm always saying, like, please, let me know, and I send you the PDF. It's short. You can read it on your
Even
iPad,
better,
on your phone, whatever. Yeah.
get the book from Maria.
Yeah,
cut the
you
middleman
can
out.
find me on
and
Twitter.
then she'll give you an autographed copy with an E.
Yeah, I'll give you a little funny autograph, in some strange languages,
The first time I interviewed Asatar Bear, he had a book that he wrote, I want to say 10 years ago, about prisons. And I was like, oh, I found it. I can buy it. He goes, please don't buy it. It's very expensive because it's an academic book. And I was like, no, that's fine. I want to support. And it was like $100. And he actually did end up suing. Yeah, because he was like, I can't.
Okay.
He goes, I don't feel comfortable with you spending that kind of money on this book.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, it's the whole publishing industry. We should have a show one day about that. It's just an insane kind of industry. They make like 40% margin on all these books and articles, and authors get paid almost nothing. And people spend money. Libraries spend so much money ordering these books, $100 books. Some of them are $200-$300. It's insane.
Some of those academic books are super expensive. Yeah,
so I always, I'm happy to share. In fact, when my first book got pirated online, I felt like that was a sign of, success, that somebody like took the effort to make it, accessible. So I was like, a friend of mine in my department, he checks all the pirated books. He's like, hey, your book is there. This is a big deal. So I was
That's like getting an Eastern Bloc Pulitzer, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, hey, this is a big. He's from Israel, but he was like, hey, have you seen your book is pirated? I'm like, I don't know where to check it, but he's into all the coding, and he like checked everything. He's like, it's right there. I was like, okay, cool. I felt very special. So if anybody wants to pirate this one, please let me know.
Well, it was a free download, and we were advertising it while it was a free download for people in the chat. So, Maria, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. I hope to see you very soon.
Someone says Bitter Lake is on Napster. I have no idea where my music is, to be honest with you. So if it's on Napster, that's funny. Cool.
I don't know.
Kuba. I told everyone about our situation with your microphone and interface because it made me so angry, because all I was happy because you were going to narrate more video essays.
Get the most out of that white Morgan Freeman voice of mine.
Oh my God. I was so hurt.
I don't know where it is. My last, I'll try to go to 1407 this weekend, but I shouldn't have to.
Can't give up all that information. There's crazy people out here, as we're finding out in real time. So thank you guys. If you haven't done it, there is a new video essay up. It's called We Don't Need Another Hero. Pascal and I did a recap show about it last night. We will not be doing a champagne room tonight, as Kuba and Maria have busy schedules controlling the world through soft power. Don't let the tie and the spunky hair fool you. They are powerful people in the world. So thank you very much. And we will see you guys Saturday at 9 a.m. Pacific time with Qualia Redux and Esperanza Fonseca. And we will be talking about these trans exclusionary laws in Texas, abortion right rollbacks in Texas and throughout the country, and more. So we will see you guys Saturday, and we are out.